Hello, everyone. So, do you see my screen? Everything is in
Yeah.
order? Okay, cool.
So good.
So, thanks for joining, and thanks again for this opportunity to present some of my preliminary findings on foreign volunteers in the Ukrainian armed forces. I've been tracking this, like my research hobby. I've been tracking this issue since 2014, actually, since the Donbass. Since the war started in the Donbass. So now it's really interesting to see how this new wave, it's something totally different, of course, because the Russian invasion happened, the full-blown invasion happened just recently, but we have already 1 year, and we have a new wave of foreigners coming, fighting on the ground here in Ukraine. When the war started, just 3 days after, Zelensky, in one of his statements, he made a call to international audience and calling actually people to come and to defend Ukraine together with Ukrainians. It was on 27th of February last year. After it was kind of a PR move. Nobody knew if it will work because back then Ukraine couldn't get, NATO defense, air defense. We're not speaking even about boots on the ground. So this was kind of the attempt to internationalize the conflict, bringing here people, the citizens of the whole world, but also the citizens of NATO and the EU. So, but it's I would like to go back again to 2014, 2021. Also experienced the inflow of foreigners who fought on both sides of the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. There are some estimates, around 17,000 of foreigners came or fought in the Donbass area, in Lugansk and Donetsk regions, in between in those years before their full-scale invasion of Russia. And 90% of those were coming actually from Russia. And they were fighting mostly on the Russian side, on the so-called LPR, DPR forces. Here we also, I put here just interesting fact about one of the Serbian guy who is one of the leaders of Chetniks, paramilitary groups in Serbia. Here we see him on one of the checkpoints in Crimea in 2014, and here he appears in during the Kremlin speech, Putin's speech in the Kremlin, just recently in February this year. So he was one of these foreign fighters, political leaders of the Serbian movement who participated both in occupation of Crimea and in the Donbass, in the conflict around the Donbass. So it's not a new phenomenon for Ukraine, but also it's not a new phenomenon for academia and research environment. Before going to my main part of the presentation, I would like to stop here and to talk about definition of foreign fighters. The definition is still contested. There are a lot of criteria how we will define those people who come and fight abroad. And one of the definitions that is loose definition, trying to cover to be umbrella definition, is one used by introduced by David Mallet, and he argues that foreign fighters could be defined as a non-citizens of a state experiencing civil conflict who arise from an external state to join insurgency. Well, in this definition, we already see that he mainly focus on civil conflict However, as we've seen in Ukraine, the foreign fighters might also be involved in interstate conflict. Also, foreign fighters may not only join the insurgent part, but also side with defenders of the government and state. And finally, here he defines the clear criteria of citizenship. So to be a foreign means to be to not hold the citizenship of the country. It's a bit a state-centric definition because it disregards foreign fighters' sense of identity. For instance, if we take foreign fighters who fought in the Donbass on the Russian side, they might perceive their identity might encompass this post-Soviet identity, and they will not define themselves as foreigner. For instance, as Ukraine, they will belong to this Russian world identity. So their identity is kind of blurred. So this is one of the problems of this more state-centric definition. One of the definitions I would like to maybe propose to take this as a basis that tries to address these issues is one by Sandra Krachenman. She defines foreign fighter as an individual who lives as an individual who leaves his or her country of origin or habitual residence to join a non-state armed group in an armed conflict abroad, and who is primarily motivated by ideology, religion, and or kinship. So here we see already that the main criteria is a motivation. So foreign fighter is the individual who actually doesn't do it for money. Primarily led by ideology, religion, or kinship. But also in her definition, we can see that foreign fighter should be defined as a person that belongs to non-state armed group. So here we have a clear difference between foreign fighter and foreign volunteer, which I will use in my presentation as a main definition, and I will present exactly about foreign volunteers rather than about foreign fighters. Also, those definitions might be used interchangeably. So foreign volunteer is a non-local member of country's official military force. So actually, if we take this definition by Sandra Krachenman and just replace a non-state armed group with an armed group, then we will have our definition of a foreign volunteer. So it's a foreign fighter who belongs to official military force. Here's my outline of presentation. Actually, I will build my presentation based on the so-called life cycle of foreign fighters or foreign volunteers. First, I will speak about pre-war mobilization phase, which includes motivation and facilitating factors. So how and what did push particular foreign fighter to join armed conflict in the foreign country? The second stage is the war stage of the life cycle of foreign volunteer. We will speak about the role of a foreign fighter in particular armed conflict, the features of his participation, and how much does he or she impacts the overall course of armed forces and armed actions, military actions in the country. And finally, the third stage is the post-war period. So actually, what we will envisage what actually volunteers plan to do after, or if they plan to do anything after their participation in the conflict. Just to so when it comes to the first mobilization phase. We currently, according to different studies, we have approximately 2,000 foreign volunteers fighting in Ukraine on the ground. Well, initially, when President Zelensky announced that we have around 20,000 applications to join the Ukrainian armed forces in their fight against Russian aggression, well, those were just applications, so-called signs of interest coming from abroad. At the same time, according to official data by International Legion of Defense of Ukraine, there are representatives of 55 countries that are enlisted in or fighting on the side of the Ukrainian armed forces. And citizens of Georgia and Belarus have the largest representation among all of them. Of course, we have a lot of people volunteers coming from US, UK, Poland, Canada, Nordic countries, and Central and Eastern European states. What does push the foreign fighters, foreign volunteers to come here actually and to fight? So according to David Mallet, every foreign fighter mobilization is the same. So first you need to have a trigger, for instance, suffering of children and women. For many foreign volunteers, such a trigger after the initial attack of Russia, and then the second trigger, the biggest trigger, was evidence of war crimes in Bucha. That was one of the biggest motivations for them to come here and join Ukraine. The second component is that foreign volunteers, they are looking for a black-white situation. So to pick up, in their opinion, good side of the conflict, where it's no gray area, and you can be really, you can define yourself as a warrior of God or of good. And the third component is adventurism. So always there is still a feeling of something interesting, exciting about going to the foreign country and participating in the military conflict. And the fourth component is the chance to start something new. For many foreign volunteers, foreign fighters, their participation was conditioned by some kind of an internal struggle about their stage of life. For instance, some of the foreign volunteers, they argued that they left jobs, they had to pay debt, or they had broke up with their wives. So they didn't have anything new. And here comes a conflict that they might find interested to join and to find the purpose, actually, and to start their life from scratch in some cases. So one note I would like to put here is my presentation is based on secondary data. So mostly I have researched various dozens of interviews on the internet of the foreign fighters. So journalistic reports, investigations, also social networks of foreign volunteers and people who interviewed them. So it's like it will serve like a baseline for any future research, because first you can have this huge amount of data analyzing and then looking for gatekeepers who might then give you access to those foreign volunteers in case you wanna do research with the primary data. So when it comes to their motivation, actually, it's a mix of idealism and with pragmatism. First, of course, it's for many of volunteers who come here, it's a just war, and it's war between good and bad, between also siding with underdog. So it's more about siding with David against Goliath situation. Also, for many volunteers, they interview foreign volunteers, they argue that it's everyone's war. It's not only war about Ukraine, it's war about the future of democracy and a struggle against tyranny and civilization versus barbarism. Another motivation is that to show that Ukraine is not alone, so to show the solidarity and to pay also debt to Ukraine. One of the foreign volunteers from Norway, she argued that Ukrainians fought in the Second World War, they suffered a lot, so it's our time to pay this debt as well. And for Georgians, for instance, it's time to pay the debt for Ukraine's involvement in 90s and in 2008 in the Russian-Georgian war. This mix of idealism and pragmatism we can encounter also when foreign volunteers argue that they came here to prevent a war coming to their own countries. For instance, it's crucial, especially for Central Eastern European states like Bulgaria, Poland, all the countries, neighboring countries of Ukraine, basically, but also for the West, for the Western Europe and Hemisphere. Another motivation is to revenge the common enemy. If we speak about Georgia or Chechen people, and to bring down the regimes there, to prove the difference. If we speak about Belarus and Russia, so foreign volunteers who came from Belarus and Russia, they consider this fight, they define this fight not only for Ukraine, for its territorial integrity and independence, but also it's a chance to liberate their own countries. There were around 10 volunteers from Taiwan who joined also Ukrainian armed forces at some point, and they actually argue that they came here to set an example for the international community in case China would like to attack in the future, would attack Taiwan. So the international community would react in the same way. And also to prepare for potential attacks. So they came here to gain experience, actually combat experience. There is a distinct category also of foreign volunteers. I would like to focus. It's ex-soldiers or veterans coming to fight because they have some military experience. And one of the main motivation of those ex-military from different parts of the world, but mainly from the West, is that they have the only profession. It's their military profession. So they may end up with some kind of jobs, but they feel inside that their real profession is the military. So for them, coming here is to prove themselves as professionals. But also they look for comradeship, for friendship. After coming from Iraq or Afghanistan, they might have lost friends, and after that, they look for something new, for new friendship, for new networks. There are, of course, war-hungry veterans without real combat experience they like to prove themselves again, like a military, on the battleground. And some veterans are just escaping mundane and boring life, according to one of their interviews. There are also professional foreign fighters or career foreign fighters who fought in Syria against ISIS, for instance. Also, there are many US veterans who, in their interviews to the press, to the media, argued that in this case, joining the Ukrainian side, it's somehow they seek redemption because of their participation in the wars. They might believe they were not just or without purpose, like Iraq war. Also, we are some of the foreign volunteers. The spirit of this adventurism. When many of volunteers who came in February and March to Ukraine, they were just simply wannabe soldiers that never had any kind of experience. They would like to make their, they were just adventurous. They were trying to make themselves important in terms of promoting in Instagram or Facebook posts, but also many were just trying to be involved in some interesting activity, and they didn't recognize that the war is happening and the war is not such a great idea to join. The next stage, actually, this is just after they decide to come, actually, we switch to recruitment stage, and after Zelensky announced the creation of this of the International Legion of Territorial Defense of Ukraine, this legion is actually within territorial defense forces, which are part of Ukrainian ground forces. So this is territorial defense started open call and application process, which was state-led process. Somehow it was chaotic at the beginning, of course, because nobody knew what will happen and how to apply. But they published the 7-step
Sorry.
Nädalavahetus on see aeg, kus
Someone needs to
see on kõige rohkem rahvast, see on kõige kallim. See on mõttetu nädalavahetus seda teha.
Hello?
Ei, me ei lähe nädalavahetusse.
Is that someone needs to mute. You need to mute. Sorry.
Yeah, it's fine. So what actually happened is foreign volunteers were asked to foreign citizens to come to Ukrainian embassy all around the world and seek for a contact with defense attachés who would make the first screening process. And then they were transferred to, they were called to come to Poland and be transferred across the border to military bases. One of the most important one was Yavoriv military base, which I will speak later, what did happen there. When it comes to the contract, so when they signing the contract, after they arrived to Ukraine, foreign volunteers become a Ukrainian soldier, which grants her the same benefits and also the same status. They sign also the contract for a duration of wartime, which is kind of infinite right now. But Ukrainian armed forces, they are quite flexible nowadays in terms of allowing foreigners to leave almost whenever they want, actually. So they're quite flexible in this case. And compared to Ukrainian soldiers enrolled in the Ukrainian armed forces, is a huge difference. Sometimes it creates also pressure, psychological pressure on foreign volunteers, because every mission, they may skip the mission, and actually it creates for them ethical dilemma, because they fight side by side with Ukrainian colleagues, but then after they, for instance, sometimes they see that the mission is suicide mission, they might decline or refuse to go into the battlefield. So that creates for them kind of ethical dilemma to deal with after. Since mid-March, it's interesting that this International Legion for Territorial Defense, or let's call it International Legion, it started to accept only foreign volunteers with real combat experience, because during the first initial stages, there were a lot of people like adventurers. They were coming to Ukraine without no prior combat experience. Also, they might have been enlisted in the military, but once they arrived to, they might have been in military for 20 years ago, 5 years ago. They didn't have physical condition to serve in the army. So they created a lot of problems for, because there will be a lot of efforts to train them again and to bring to the battlefield well equipped. So we also need to consider that International Legion is not kind of a separate unit. It's an administrative structure which operates and accepts this application and tries to put different volunteers in separate units. But there are two main wings of International Legion. One is under defense intelligence, and the intelligence they of course select the most experienced foreign volunteers coming from special forces from the USA, from UK, etc. And another wing of the International Legion is the ground forces of just military. But for many during the selection process, of course, there is some screening, which was quite vague maybe at the beginning, but later on the International Legion started to be more attentive to those who are applying to the armed forces of Ukraine. So many who came there, especially to Yavoriev military base. It was a huge base where Ukraine before previously had a lot of international training with NATO partners, and that base became the first kind of military base for training ground, together all the foreigners who were coming to Ukraine to fight on the Ukrainian side. But on March 13, Russia attacked the military base with missile attacks, and then actually it's unclear if the International Legion claims that there were no killed on the side of foreigners, but some of the buildings were destroyed by Russian missiles, and Ukrainian staff suffered enormously there. But many foreigners, they ran away in the forest and they had to stay there. And after this attack, there was a huge chaos, and many foreigners, even those who were serving in the military before, they just decided to leave Ukraine for good. And that kind of this event served as kind of a filter, because in the future the proportion of those volunteers who were more committed to fight and were more prepared physically and psychologically increased, definitely. So here you can see also alternative hosts for foreign volunteers in Ukraine. One of the most famous is Georgian National Legion, which had already previous experience of taking US and UK special forces guys. But also foreign volunteers, after they arrived, they were a bit lost. Sometimes they didn't get to the International Legion, so they started to find a way to get into the armed forces of Ukraine. And actually they managed to join separate units within armed forces of Ukraine. So even now, a lot of foreigners, they change their affiliation between different units. So it's always a huge inflow of foreigners between the units, incoming, outgoing, because many foreign volunteers leaving Ukraine to, if they were injured, for instance, they coming back, resupply, etc. So it's a huge movement of people, and sometimes it's really hard to track to which to which unit particular volunteer actually is attached. It's interesting that also International Legion didn't accept Russian citizens. and for them there were two units mainly. One of the two major units were created by Russian citizens who ran away from Putin's regime, or who lived here already in Ukraine, or from Russian diaspora. Also from those soldiers who, on the Russian side, who decided to give up and came to switch to the Ukrainian side. So one of them is Legion Freedom of Russia, and this one is more like liberal unit. So they still claim that they want to remove the regime of Putin. And another one is Russian Volunteer Corps, which is more right-wing. And I will speak about those later. When it comes to what kind of role foreign volunteers play in the Ukrainian conflict right now, one should know that it's not only about fighting in the combat, actually, because the majority of those volunteers who came, they did find themselves not involved in the armed conflict or attached to the units, but also do all kinds of different jobs. Of course, there is a huge part of these combatants, fighters, around 2,000 approximately. They mainly conduct reconnaissance and sabotage missions, especially if they belong to special forces from Western countries. And on the front lines, the most experienced ones are those who fight in the trenches. And those are, for instance, Belarusians, Georgians, and Chechens. But many foreign volunteers, they decided that their contribution might be needed in training and becoming military instructors because of provision of basic training given the shortage of Ukrainian structures. There is many Ukrainian structures, they went actually to fight on the front line. So there are a lot of mobilized people Ukrainians who should be trained by foreigners. And another huge and medical supply, as well as evacuation of civilians. Also, there are volunteers who, again, veterans from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from different kind of conflicts, who are conducting demining activities. Because according to the recent data, it will take maybe 70 years to completely to achieve demining in Ukraine. And there is also advocacy for International Legion also is doing advocacy for weapon deliveries and PR communication work to deliver message about the conflict to the international audience. When we come to the experience, actual experience of combat of foreign volunteers, what we can say, what they actually tell us about their experience being involved in the battlefield. So one of the biggest difference is that their experience of being involved in other conflicts, in case they were involved in the conflict before, it's a level of intensity, of course, because the scale of casualties, the types of weapons used, and the vast territories involved make this war the biggest since the Second World War. One of the volunteers, he actually says that even one day fighting in Severodonetsk was more stressful than a month in Iraq or Afghanistan. Another distinctive feature is, of course, the firepower and resources of Ukraine compared to Russia. Here, foreign volunteers had to accept the status being underdog, because for many, for instance, US veterans coming here, and they also accept this, they recognize it's a problem that US soldiers are kind of spoiled because of access to unlimited resources during their deployment in Iraq or Afghanistan. So here many even many of those veterans who even came to Ukraine and had previous military service in hotspots in Iraq and Afghanistan, they sometimes couldn't handle average mortar fire, and they decided to leave as well. Another moment that underlined in the interviews of foreign fighters, that's a learning curve. So they are learning something new, and especially when compared to when they compare Ukrainian military to the Western military, here we have a really extensive experience of trench warfare, which requires the survival skills. Actually, how to make a fire, how to not freeze to death, etc. So, and some of the volunteers, they mentioned that in their home countries, those skills have been neglected for some time already, well, during their training. When it comes to experience of what is experience of foreign volunteers with Ukrainian institutions, how they compare, for instance, Ukraine's approach to the operations, they state that there's a lot of creativity on the Ukrainian side, but at the same time, there is a problem with the Soviet doctrines that still penetrate the work of Ukrainian military. And sometimes Ukrainian military is reluctant to learn from those more experienced foreign volunteers, arguing that, you know, we've been here for 8 years, don't teach us, don't try to teach us. We know how to deal with war. Also, they mentioned that, of course, there's still a lot of should be done in terms of bringing Ukraine to the NATO standards. And sometimes foreign volunteers were actually sent, they argued, to suicide missions, using as an infantry without background, you know, without you know, thinking about where they should go, what kind of intelligence they have, etc. So many volunteers, they thought that they are a waste of human resources because Ukraine didn't really ask them about the operations, didn't really provide them information about where they go, and they just dropping them on the spots and telling them to attack one spot or to protect one or other building. Of course, in those interviews, they're quite critical because maybe during the first months of war, they'll be critical actually to fill the gaps in the Ukrainian defense. So Ukraine armed forces used every opportunity, every soldiers they had, just to plug in, just to defend, for instance, Kyiv and Irpin and Bucha, where the first battles of foreign fighters happened. Also, foreign volunteers spoke about some corruption issues, and there are some shady personages and criminal elements that kind of penetrated some of the structures of International Legion, and actually still there are some investigations going on, and there were 2 big reports by Kyiv Independent journalists, and as far as I know, those cases are still open. So there's still some problems in terms of bureaucracy within the International Legion, but also within the units. When it comes to actual impact, so what foreign volunteers did bring here right now, of course, when we compare 2,000 of foreign volunteers fighting in Ukrainian armed forces, but now Ukrainian defense forces constitute around 1 million people. So 2,000 and 1 million people, I'm not sure that we can speak about really tangible impact on operational level, but at some point they were critical in some tactical level, For instance, as I mentioned, foreign volunteers participated in the liberation of Kiev. They did defend Irpin and Bucha, take counterattacks there. And also they were sent to really hot spots in Ukraine when Ukraine was conducting counteroffensive actions in Severodonetsk, in Lysychansk, in Kharkiv, and Kherson. Also being there was a huge boost for Ukrainian soldiers. If they've seen some, operative from SAS or US SOF colleagues fighting side by side with them. So it really helps Ukrainian soldiers feel that they are not abandoned by also the international community. But the impact, again, I'm coming back to the tasks that they perform here. It's not about to the battlefield, it's not limited to the battlefield, but also training of reserve and mobilized soldiers, providing humanitarian help, but also the PR activities. So when the foreign fighter comes, there are a lot of interviews already of foreign volunteers coming back, for instance, to after the injury or coming, leaving Ukraine for good, and they coming to their countries and they speak about the conflict, about the war crimes they've seen, and that's how they Ukraine is still on the agenda of media and politicians on the West. So it's kind of injections against Ukraine fatigue abroad, being that foreign volunteers bring to the international community. And when it comes to actually about the last stage, return, still a lot of foreign volunteers are still involved in the war. So we didn't really reach the stage when there will be a mass exodus of foreign volunteers, because some of them may resettle in Ukraine. They already indicated they want to buy a house here after the war is finished. But also when we speak about foreign volunteers, we need to take in mind how their home countries actually define them, how they regulate their activities. Even before, during their initial arrival, many countries, for instance, Georgia, it was interesting to see how the Georgian government actually, they didn't let some foreign volunteers to land their airplane, and Ukrainian Prime Minister asked specifically to his counterpart in Georgia to let those foreign volunteers to come during the first days of Russian attack. So some of the countries, they really put sticks in the wheels of foreign volunteers coming here. But again, different countries, different policies. We still have, like, for instance, Czechia is granting impunity to all the volunteers who are fighting on the Ukrainian side. Australia, for instance, and Korea, once the foreign volunteer comes to those countries, he or she can be arrested, actually. So what is another important point when we speak about the return of volunteers? Do they possess a threat? Because in many countries, foreign fighters or foreign volunteers still associated with the terrorist activities or with extremism. So according to Polish researcher Remizov, most likely it doesn't apply to those foreign volunteers who came at this stage of war to Ukraine. At the same time, those volunteers who are returning from a war zone have likely been exposed to potentially traumatized events. And of course, they should be careful case-by-case approach and veteran policies designed for volunteers who come back from Ukraine. Recovered, for instance, he suggests to apply Aarhus model of reintegration of such volunteers that follows a model of reintegration of extremists who are coming from the ISIS, who fought in the Middle East. But at the same time, this intervention should be really careful, because those volunteers, mostly they are veterans, and actually veterans should approach those, not like a security guys or police who will question them immediately after their arrival to their home countries. What is important also is to emphasize that Ukraine also have a policy regarding volunteers, and it's interesting that when it comes to Belarus and Russian foreign volunteers who are fighting within Ukrainian armed forces or the units attached to Ukrainian armed forces under the control of Ukraine, they don't receive any guarantees and benefits. And they could be kicked out from the country. So they don't have pension, they don't have compensation for their injuries, and also compensation if they actually die, because the compensation is 15 million hryvnias, which is more than $300 for if volunteer. So the family of volunteer can receive such money if the volunteer died, actually. But there is a specific law in Ukraine that excludes Belarus and Russian citizens from this benefit. So it's a huge problem now in Ukraine when Belarus constitutes one of the biggest. There are a majority of Belarusians that fight in Ukraine, and there are a lot of them, maybe up to 1,000 or something, and they will not benefit from the Ukrainian social system, actually. Of course, there is also, I will try to wrap up here really. There is also a political agenda, of course, because all those foreign volunteers who stay in Ukraine are also, they see themselves changing, especially those coming from near abroad, from Georgia, from Chechnya, from Belarus, and from Russia as well, that their fight will lead to the change of the regime actually in their home countries. At the same time, we already see there are different tensions between political opposition in Belarus, for instance, and one of the most famous regiment in Ukraine, Belarus regiment, Kalinovsky regiment. For instance, Kalinovsky regiment, it doesn't have really links with Tikhanovsky office, and they established their own council with elected leadership. So they kind of pursue already some political ambitions. And it's interesting that Ukrainian position sometimes supports official position of Zelensky and the government. They remain cautious about Tikhanovskaya, as they don't have any official contacts with Tikhanovskaya, at least open public contacts. But for instance, the Zelensky party and other MPs, they met with Kalinovsky representatives with the regiment, so military guys, and they kind of push this message we should support this kind of opposition, which will bring real change to Belarus and will take down Lukashenko. So there's still there are a lot of discussions in Ukraine how Ukraine actually should mitigate all the risks, and also if Ukraine really should take the side and to support one of the parties, military or political wing of the Belarus opposition. And finally, just recently we had another accident on the Russian-Ukrainian border when one of the Russian volunteer corps, which still operates in Ukraine and in cooperation with the Ukrainian military, because it's impossible that any volunteer or foreign volunteers having this group of people operating freely without consent of Ukrainian special services or spецслужб. So this regiment or Russian volunteer corps, this group made the incursion into the Bryansk Oblast in Russia, and actually they made this provocation, claiming that well, finally we're making some changes in Russia, and it's time for Russia to raise up against the Putin. It's interesting that this Russian group or volunteer group is led by Denis Kapustin, which is a far-right extremist figure. Sorry, once again. And actually, he Ukrainian position in we can see the part of his memorandum of this Russian volunteer corps political memorandum. They would like to, of course, to overthrow the ruling regime, but also to guarantee national freedom of the Russian people within Russia and respect the right of people living in the territory of Russian Federation on self-determination. So actually, it's a really radical nationalistic point of view point of view of Russian nationalists to pursue this policy of maybe which will lead to some kind of disintegration of Russia. But it's interesting that Ukrainian position is also quite vague, because they claim that the Ukrainian intelligence, Ukrainian office of the president of Ukraine, they all claim that they didn't authorize, they don't know what's happening. It's internal problem of Russia. So it's some kind of domestic process that already started in Russia, and they actually leave it up to Russian people to decide what to do with it. So maybe Ukraine, in this case, pursue a kind of a chaos, trying to create a chaos inside of Russia by using these different kind of radical groups. But still, we're not sure if it really benefits Ukraine, if using those radical, even far-right extremist figures to make some political steps within the Russia and support also by supported in international media will help. In terms of impact, we also I would like to conclude here that at least 150 volunteers actually died in actions since February 24. Maybe it's maybe 2 weeks ago these numbers came. I guess maybe the numbers are increasing. So we see that those numbers, those representatives of different countries, actually, we have a lot of different, even exotic countries like Colombia coming and Brazil coming and dying for Ukraine and for the people. So these volunteers definitely are making some impact, and hopefully we will see much less faces on these boards. Thank you for attention.
Great, thank you. So are there any questions? Maybe I'll start by asking, I mean, has the level of interest in fighting in Ukraine, have you seen any trends on that level? I think, a number of us have been sort of kind of tracking potential Ukraine fatigue. I'm wondering whether you've seen sort of a decline of interest or increase, or, is it sort of steady? Or
in terms of foreign volunteers coming here, right? Yeah, well, actually, there is a policy from the Ukrainian armed forces and from international legions. They don't share exact numbers of the numbers of volunteers. It's a policy since March. So actually, even if we ask, for instance, representatives, they will not tell us officially. So that could be only, there is no data if there are like more volunteers coming or not, but definitely we're still not at the stage that they're leaving, they're coming back. For instance, there are a lot of volunteers who, got injured, and going to their home countries, going to hospitals, and then coming back packed with supplies for their comrades, actually. So we still don't see this tendency of mass exodus of foreign volunteers, because the war on the media is still, in the hot stage, and they will not leave until at least those really dedicated people who didn't leave in March and April after, for instance, Kiev was freed. Those dedicated volunteers, they will not leave until the Ukraine-Russia war will reach some point, decisive moment. There will be so they will feel that their mission is accomplished. But of course, unfortunately, I don't have statistics and data, so it's maybe for the future kind of research.
Petro, Muzik, do you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Artem, for a actually brilliant presentation. My question is as follows. What's your assessment of the importance of this foreign legion fighting in this war for Ukraine? Is it really an important force, or maybe we are just, there's too much fuss about all this participation of foreigners in this war? Thanks.
Well, I mean, Ukraine is not the first conflict that attracted foreign volunteers. There are many instances, like Spanish Civil War, one of the biggest case. And for now, it depends how you look at it. Because for Ukraine, of course, Ukraine benefits from people coming here, because first of all, those who have really combat experience and military experience, they do save lives, actually. If they train someone, if they're fighting in the trenches or doing some special operations. So in this case, of course, any kind of help is, is good for Ukraine. But also this PR effect, actually, when those they become agents of Ukraine actually abroad, and they keep Ukraine and in the pages of newspapers and online media, actually, and that also many people who were not really following the conflict, they started to follow conflict actually by following their fellow nationals who went actually to fight. So it's kind of educative and soft power instrument for Ukraine. But again, in terms of the number, of course, they will not win this war for Ukraine, because it's only around 2,000 of volunteers compared to 1 million of Ukrainian soldiers. But still, I mean, the influence, the participation is still important here.
Mykola?
Yes, thank you, Artem, for brilliant presentations. I have one question about Crimean Tatars units. I listened to interview with Rifat Chubarov, this is the leader of Crimean Tatar Majlis, and he said the Nomad Chelebjihan company, well known, is a part of foreign legion of Ukraine. And it's strange for me, because Crimean Tatars are Ukrainian citizens. Could you clarify what is the reason to include the Crimean Tatar company to foreign legion?
Artem, we can't really hear you.
Do you have any problems? Do you hear me?
Now, go ahead. Can you answer the question?
Okay. I would like to ask you about Crimean Tatars in foreign legion. I listened to the interview with Rifat Chubarov.
I think we heard the question, but Artem, are you there, Artem? I think he may have left us.
Yeah, he disappeared.
He disappeared.
I'm not lucky.
Okay. Oh, here he comes back. Artem, did you hear the question?
Yeah. No, I heard only part of it because about Rifat Chubar and I disappeared.
I will repeat. I listened to interview with Rifat Chubarov, leader of Majlis of Crimean Tatars, and he said the Crimean Tatar company belongs to foreign legion and fights for Ukraine in this unit. It's strange because Crimean Tatars are Ukrainian citizens. Could you clarify why Crimean Tatars company, Noman Cherepzhihan company, is a part of foreign legion?
Actually, I didn't dip so much into the Crimean Tatar issue. I know there is a separate unit, definitely. There is Krim also, as far as I know, unit, but inside the international legion, it doesn't mean that all the units are contain only foreign volunteers. Officers and sergeants are Ukrainians, so they are on the leadership positions first of all. Also, the units, they might not be homogeneous. They might comprise from Crimean Tatars, but also other Turk members, maybe from Uyghurs, for instance, Kazakh, Uzbekistan representatives. So this kind of units might also comprise, Crimean Tatars, but also representative of other nationalities, which either might, could be also divided by religion, for instance. There could be totally Muslim unit, or could be Turk-speaking unit, because there is one unit by one Kyrgyz guy who established his unit, and he brought only Turkish-speaking people inside of this unit. So, but it will be interesting to also for me to see what is the proportion maybe of Crimean Tatars, because definitely it couldn't be only Crimean Tatars inside of international legion units. There should be some foreigners, definitely. So the issue is about how many volunteers from other countries are there.
Right. Mariana?
Hello, colleagues. Hello, Andre. Hello, Artem. Thank you for the presentation. I wanted to ask several questions, so just stop me if maybe we'll make some pauses. So the first one would be, you mentioned several aspects where Ukrainian authorities could do better job. At least this is my interpretation when it comes to organizing volunteers and all this movement in the fighting for Ukraine, also organizing their some social benefits or any kind of other organizational administrative aspects of their involvement in the ongoing war. So what would be, I was wondering, what would be your suggestions for the Ukrainian government on how to proceed with the managing of this fighters, so the volunteers in the ongoing war? So like if to mention that, for example, two things, you would then say, okay, things could be improved in terms of management, in terms of either acquiring more people or then ensuring their better situation in Ukraine, or can you just list for us something that you would say, okay, these are the kind of points you would say as a recommendation for the Ukrainian government? This was the first question, and if I may, I would just briefly mention another question. Another one would be, you mentioned the, for example, involvement of some Russian volunteers, volunteers from Belarus. What do you know of the cases, for example, of involvement for volunteers from the countries which are again considered not very friendly to Ukraine currently, right? Countries like Hungary and Serbia, and I mean we can continue the list definitely. And whether the Ukrainian government, which again goes maybe into the recommendation for the Ukrainian government, to use those cases to say, you know, well, to promote this further internationally, this involvement among these countries, but other countries internationally. So, yeah, these are two questions. Thank you in advance.
Yes, thanks, Mariana, for two great questions. Actually, those are not easy ones, because it's it goes into the field of policy recommendations for the Ukrainian government, especially during this wartime. But when I spoke about benefits, actually, specifically about Belarus and Belarus citizens who are really often they are kicked out from Ukraine, and there should be some reform of immigration service in Ukraine, because first there are several draft laws already in the parliament about benefits to Belarus citizens, so they could apply for citizenship also, given their battle experience, but also having, you know, to exclude these norms of, you know, not giving these deposits, you know, if for instance, if the volunteer is dead, is killed in action. So for me, it's more about pushing the current legislation, which is in Parliament, also advocated by some of the MPs from Vol's party. So it's more about listening to actual volunteers, because because the situation with Belarus volunteers is more critical, because if they kicked out from the country, they might end up in Lukashenko hands, as well as, you know, as well as the Russian citizens as well, who switch the side. So actually, it's more about building the dialogue between policymakers, between the government, who should listen to those people. And there are like many already stories of volunteers had to give up, had to leave Ukraine just to run away, because they don't receive any benefits. Because in case of Belarus, for instance, in case of any foreign citizens like Russian or Belarus, you need to serve in the military for 3 years to gain the citizenship. So it should be permanent contract for 3 years, and that makes really hard for them. There are a lot of administrative burdens that should be removed, so they could claim the citizenship actually, or at least a refugee status in Ukraine. In terms of other foreign volunteers, I mean, this information where there are a lot of critical moments that I mentioned, but it also, I think there is some bias in, of course, because I didn't go to the field, and media reports mostly when you interview people, of course, they will speak about their negative experience mostly. Of course, there were some bits of positive information, positive feedback about Ukrainian armed forces and how everything is built, but because of this media bias, we hear more negative voices, of course. So I think another point is just to also to find positive feedback and to kind of balance the opinion about what's going on already for like 1 year in Ukraine. I mean, it's really a tough question for you, of course, in terms of recommendations. And the second question is about foreign volunteers who also kind of not friendly countries, right? Coming from non-friendly countries, kind of, or those who
perceived, of course,
who don't really support openly, whatever. Actually, on one of my first slides, I'm not sure, I'm not sharing anymore, but there is a Hungarian page actually on one of the volunteer hands. But I personally, didn't hear a lot of stories about like Serbian or Hungarian coming. I've heard stories about Central Asia. The one guy Kazbek who also brought some guys from Uzbekistan, from Kazakhstan, who perceive Russia also being, having this empire, like fighting Russia's empire, who colonized this population within Russia, but also in near abroad. So there are stories like that. Brazil, there are people from Brazil, because even the previous president, far-right president in Brazil, they didn't also support Ukraine, but also now the new president, leftist president, it's also kind of we're losing this global south, right? And Brazil especially. There were also South African, I've heard, but I haven't heard his remarks and interviews. But again, I mean, it's not a huge amount, but 52 nationalities or 55 are fighting. So I guess there are definitely some people coming from this kind of countries who are not openly supporting Ukraine. Please.
Great. Petro?
Thank you, Luka. Artem, thank you for the presentation. I have rather two comments about it. First, about the definition you use when you speak about foreign volunteers, and that was clear in your presentation that you combine or you unite, I think, two different groups. One group, people who are combatants, right, who are serving the armed forces and who engage Russians in a fight, and there is another group, and I think that maybe in your further research, maybe if you like, they can be. You can look at them in a different way, and I speak about civic volunteers, people who are non-combatants. For instance, the so-called Mozart group, which consists of Americans, Canadians who conduct a civilian evacuation of people, for instance, from Bakhmut, and who say very straightforwardly that they are not going to engage in fighting in any way. And also we can add here demining, because we also have an American citizens who participate in demining and who even conduct fundraising companies inside the United States. They meet with senators, etc., members of Congress, and they fundraise money for this activity. And they also state very clearly that their mission is not to kill Russians, but to help Ukrainians. I think if you go further, maybe we can find even different motivations or even different social dynamic into these groups, and therefore maybe we cannot name both groups. We cannot unite them under one like an umbrella name of foreign volunteers. Maybe we can think about foreign volunteer combatants, or maybe foreign volunteer civil or aid or humanitarian workers. And another comment is that when we look at the composition of different combatant groups, you mentioned the Georgian Legion, there are Chechen formations, there are several Belarusian formations, and Russian formations. Maybe it would be interesting to look into these separate groups as distinctive cases and look at them separately and study them separately in order to find the similarities and differences between these groups. Because, for instance, I can understand that Georgians and Chechens, they want to set scores with Russians and to kill them because of the history of their countries. While for Americans, for the people from the Northern America, from Europe, that can be different. In many cases, actually, Russia was an ally of their countries during the Second World War, for instance, and their countries never fought or didn't fought for centuries with each other. and even Russia has a positive image inside their countries, or neutral image. So maybe it will be interesting to look at these different national groups and compare them against each other to see what unites and what are the difference between them. Thank you. But anyway, that was very interesting.
Thank you, Petrov, for these remarks. Yeah, coming to your first remark, yeah, I mentioned briefly that there are different volunteer groups. Of course, in a strict sense, right? In a narrow sense, when I spoke about foreign volunteers, I still were presenting about combatants mainly. But to show that the combatants, they're only a part of the huge group of this civil movement, as you mentioned, demining humanitarian ones. But what actually is interesting is that many volunteers, combatants who come to Ukraine, they might switch roles. So for instance, they initially come to train people, not to be involved in direct military activities, but then they see that, okay, I need to go and fight. Or it could happen other way around. There are like instances when foreign volunteer who thought he got injured and he got enough of fighting, and he thought that I will be more useful by training civilians to fight, to mobilize. So it's also not only about fluctuation between units, but also between those different groups of volunteers, of foreigners who come here. And it depends on how we define in narrow sense, or in more like, because volunteer in our sense is always somebody, you know, coming from NGO sector or whatever. But when we come about the combatants, foreign volunteers, yeah, it's the difference between volunteers who fight, but also the volunteers who help on the ground. But also they can bear different roles in different stages of the war. Yeah, Mozart group, of course, and actually they renamed the Mozart group. They canceled this name as far as I know, because they said like, we were not like Wagner. They made this group like a Wagner, PMC Wagner, but then there were a lot of negative public information, so they canceled. So yeah, he clearly came with the humanitarian activities. But also the one guy from demining, who does demining, he was doing demining for Azov in 2014-15 and EOD training. And he was a fighter, but then he switched to demining activities, and he helps now Ukrainian police to demine. So yeah, it's really interesting to see how all these different people, volunteers, move within this environment and how they switch their roles. When it comes to
yeah, you're hello.
Hello?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah. Perception about, as far as I understood, like perception of Russia within units that fight Russia, actually. Yeah, like so there are difference between, in your opinion, there is like Chechen opinion on Russia, but also if there is US volunteer coming here fight Russia, he might have another opinion on Russia. Or did I understand you correctly?
Yes, I think that maybe it's better to study separately people from the, let's say, realm of the former Russian Empire, and people from the very different cultural and historical context who came to Ukraine, maybe to better understand the motives and drivers why people join. That's just a suggestion.
Well, if we go back to the 2014, 2021, well, there are a lot of different people coming here to Ukraine, and they definitely have different perception, because there were this kind of brown-red cocktail of people coming and fighting on both sides. For instance, you can find neo-Nazi or nationalistic guy on Russia, but also his friend on Ukrainian side fighting, and they have kind of the same but also different perception of the conflict. Now the situation really changed, so I'm not sure that we might find really a lot of difference, because the aim, of course, the aim of Chechens or Georgians might be really maximalistic in terms of Russia. Yes, that Russia might be disintegrated, for instance. So then we might take like perception from European and Western European society countries and compare the perception about the future of Russia, what kind of victory those societies would like to achieve in this battle, right? So of course it will be different from Ukrainian victory, it might be different from Chechen victory over Russia, and maybe I think it's a good idea to see the larger picture of within those states.
Great. I actually have 2 more questions, and first is, I mean, I guess the framing is overall is that this is a net positive, but I'm think about first of all not that many people in the grand, and also I mean there must be a sort of from the Ukrainian side a logistical headache of many of these people presumably don't speak Ukrainian or Russian. Some of them I imagine are quite mentally unstable. I mean, who with their own sort of issues of PTSD and the like. So I'm just wondering, like, I just I'm thinking from the point of view of the Ukrainian government that are so overwhelmed with the invasion. I mean, how much bandwidth? How much is it? What are the sort of the logistical difficulties from the Ukrainian side of dealing? Can you talk a little bit about that? The sort of downsides, I guess, of having these foreigners who, where are they? You have to keep track of them. They might do crazy shit. I mean, I don't know. I'm just if you could talk a little more about the downsides.
Yeah, definitely, especially during the first months of the conflict, when Zelensky made this call, there was a huge chaos, and actually because of this chaos, bureaucratic chaos, many foreign volunteers they left Ukraine during the first stages. They were disillusioned, or they seek. They were looking for other units to that's where comes networking, because many volunteers they met some people on the road, they met some Ukrainian military, but there are also separate recruiters from Ukrainian military units actually going to the border or like Lviv, for instance, and they're trying also to pick up those volunteers. So there is a competition sometimes, especially during the first of the day of war, because there's Georgian Legion that have a huge image, great image of fighters, social networks, etc. So people are really keen to join them because they know they're professionals. Same would apply to Ukrainian regular units, actually. Of course, back then, the image of Ukrainian regular units were like not so good, but then after every month of the war, I think many people would like to join the armed forces separate units, but it depends also from these units. Do they have really officers who speak language? Because it's a huge problem, of course. But what armed forces, these separate units, they tactics also, they were creating these groups of volunteers, like 13, 15, 20, like whatever they can take, absorb, and they designate officers. So they're creating mini units within their units, like it was in 2014-15, when volunteers were fighting in battalions like Dobrobat, in militia battalions that were not part of the Ukrainian armed forces. So the Ukrainian armed forces kind of takes this strategy and now apply it to nowadays, absorbing these foreign volunteers who are not part of International Legion, who are not part of other units, and but again, the issue of vetting, the issue of security, clearance. I mean, how do you know? Like, those security service should go and interview guys, and what is really important here. So you need to have also a foreigner, like foreign volunteers, like the Korean guy from Korea, SEALs. He said, like, Ukrainians, they don't understand is this guy fake or not. But if I will interview him like for 5 or 6 minutes, I really understand like who is this guy? Is he like really this ambitious, crazy guy who would like to make a mess, and post Instagram pictures? So actually, Ukrainians, they might not have enough expertise to define who is really appropriate for a unit. So I think it's a lot of crazy stuff. But at least in the media, we haven't heard any crazy stories, like shooting or killing, on the side of foreign volunteers. Like at least I haven't seen this kind of negative stories. Some guys who can have a mental breakdown, you know, do some stuff. At least on my side, I haven't seen this. Maybe if you have, please share.
But and so you still think that, I mean, given the logistical difficulties from the Ukrainian side, it is still a net benefit for Ukraine?
You see, during first initial move, maybe PR effect was bigger, but I think now it becomes more professionalized, I think. So a lot of people who came here like just, you know, play Call of Duty or Counter-Strike, they left and they will not never come back. Even so, those who networks that they have here, and they will communicate between each other, you know, these volunteers, not so many of them, and they attract other people, you know, like through their veterans connection, etc. So it becomes more, it became less PR, but more professionalized, I guess.
Maybe you could just talk really briefly about what you know. I mean, this is obviously not the focus of your study, but foreigners on the Russian side. Do you have anything to say?
Foreigners, yeah, before 2021, there were a lot of foreigners on the Russian side, but now Russia, more foreigners, like there were information that Wagner, private military company Wagner, is bringing some guys from Syria, from Palestine, and we've seen some footage actually with people from Africa also joining these forces. But again, in terms of numbers, I'm not sure they have a huge inflow of people who are ready to die, and even if they paid. But also what is interesting, Putin made a special decree, actually he introduced a decree which allowed foreigners to serve 1-year contract in the Russian army. Before it was 3 or 5 years minimum. So he kind of opened this invitation. At the same time, right now, if you sign the contract with Russian army, even if you're a foreigner, you cannot end this contract as any other Russian contract serviceman, because the war is going on, and I mean it's you are there, and that's it. You know, there is no way back until the end of the war, or you're dead or you're injured. So I'm not sure that. They more still focus on the prisons of Russian domestic population. Yeah, there were instances when one foreigner died, Congolese student or somebody from the African student who was in Russian prison for 9 years.
Zambia, it was Zambia.
Zambia, yeah, or Zambia. I'm sorry, from Zambia, and he was for some drug crime. And he was recruited actually by Wagner or by Russian military, and he died. And there was a huge scandal, or at least scandal, even there was some reaction from the Zambian government in this case. So they go to prisons even to recruit foreigners who sit in Russian prisons, actually. Yeah.
Okay, Andres, do you want to?
Yes, thank you, Artem, for a fascinating presentation. I didn't hear all of it, so perhaps you already mentioned this, but this is picking up a little bit on what Petro was saying earlier about the sort of different motivations. And I wanted to ask about the Ukrainian diaspora, because that's, I think, something particularly relevant for Canada. Do you have any sort of indication about, say, percentage of people who, particularly from around here, who've come from the diaspora, and their motivation, their interests?
Well, it's really hard to measure in terms of numbers, but at least from the list of people I've seen in the list of those who were killed in action, for instance, there were Ukrainians, there were citizens of France or in Canada and other countries, or Israel as well, who have like Ukrainian surnames, definitely. So they coming from this kind of diaspora organizations, from diaspora. And I think diaspora also, representatives of diaspora were coming after or before the invasion in 2014, 15, 16, when there was this first hot stage of war. But definitely it constitutes I think important part of foreign volunteers. especially given their knowledge of language. Actually, there was a UK guy who died also recently. He also spoke fluent Ukrainian, and I think he immigrated not so long time ago. So there are different, of course, diasporas as well. He served in Ukraine military in rifleman for 4 years, and he had to stop his contract and he came here. So he also, this diaspora, I think what's important that they might serve this bridging link between and business officers or like soldiers who kind of bring volunteers, but also who communicate and and do logistics things and arrange stuff within particular units. If they join, not International Legion but other armed forces units. But in terms of numbers, it's hard for me to say. But when you check the numbers of killed in actions, there are definitely some Ukrainian surveys appear.
Great. Okay, well, I think we'll just wrap it up there. Thank you so much, Artem. That was amazing talk, very, very educational. So next we have Petro Kuzik who will present on March 13th at 10 a.m. 10 a.m. Toronto time. And so I look forward to seeing you there. But thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for your questions and attention. Thanks for hanging.